If we learned anything on Friday, it's that starting pitching costs a lot on the trade market right now.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're listening to Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day, and thank you for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network. On the show today, we're going to talk about a couple of big trades that happened on Friday and how they showcase just how much the ask is right now if you're trying to trade for young starting pitching on the market. We'll go through what those trades were and what they could mean for the Mets moving forward. In the second segment, we're going to talk about the trade market. Does it make sense for the Mets to part with some of their very top prospects to get a top pitcher? What pitcher is even going to be available based on the costs and the market that has been set with some of these other deals? And in the final segment, we're going to talk payroll. Steve Cohen had some tweets that went out today on Friday that definitely drew a lot of attention, and it was all related to how much the Mets are going to spend in 2026. Before we get to any of that, though, I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. I've been covering the New York Mets on this show since the 2019 season. This is the #1 daily podcast on the New York Mets. Want to find any of my written work, you can do so over at justbaseball.com, where I work as the editor-in-chief. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. All right, so let's go through these trades that took place. The one that was the most fascinating was a three-teamer that netted the Pittsburgh Pirates Brandon Lowe from the Rays. And here's how the trade went down. The Pirates traded Mike Burrows. That's it. They get Brandon Lowe. They get former Mets prospect Jake Mangum, and they get Mason Montgomery. Now, Brandon Lowe is a 30 home run bat at the second base position. Graded out as one of the worst defenders at second base last year. He is making $11.5 million on a club option for this season. So I think at that price tag, because he's not a great defender, I imagine he did not have the most value on the trade market. I'm sure the Rays have been shopping him, but still, for the Pirates to get Brandon Lowe, who is going to honestly be maybe their best hitter. I mean, they got O'Neal Cruz, they have Brian Reynolds, they have some bats there. Not many actually had above average offensive season. So it wouldn't even be crazy to say Brandon Lowe becomes their best hitter. They get Jake Mangum, who hit 296 this past season in his rookie year with the Rays. Now, he doesn't slug much, doesn't walk much, so he's still a limited offensive piece because even hitting, 296, he still had a below average OPS and his WRC plus was 96. So he's still graded out as a below average hitter, but he was a 2-win player because he's a good defender in all three spots in the outfield. A really nice fourth outfielder with pretty much full control, 5 years of control. And for the Pirates, probably their, starting left fielder or right fielder because they'll still put O'Neal Cruz in center. That's two bats that immediately slot into their lineup. And Mason Montgomery didn't have the best season for the Rays in his first full campaign, ERA over 5, but he throws 98 from the left side. So that's a reliever that could be a big piece for the Pirates this upcoming season, all for a guy in Mike Burrows who pitched to a 3.94 ERA across 96 innings in a rookie campaign. Made 19 starts, pitched in 23 games overall, struck out 97 batters. He's not a bad pitcher, but Mike Burrows essentially coming off like Tyler McGill's rookie season in 2021, and you get a guy in Brandon Lowe who is a 30 home run hitter, someone that will start in your outfield, and a reliever with some upside. That's showing you the incredible value that is being put on pitchers with control. Because for the Pirates, while Mike Burrows was going to slot into their rotation, they still have so many other guys that they value at a more of a premium when you're looking at, of course, Paul Skeens. They also have Bubba Chandler. You have Jared Jones, who I can't remember. He might be hurt. He might be coming off TJ. But still, they have Jared Jones that would have had a lot of value, in a potential trade. They have Mitch Keller, and they're able to pull off their biggest move in the offseason for Mike Burrows. And the Astros get in on this 3-team trade because they needed depth in their rotation. So they're the team that gets Burrows. And what does it cost them to trade for Mike Burrows? Their 4th and 5th best prospect in their system. Now, it's a bad system. We rank it over at justbaseball.com, and Jacob Melton was 4th. Anderson Brito was 5th. Melton is essentially a outfield replacement for Jake Mangum for the Rays. Guy that can play all 3 spots, good defender, he's got speed. Unlike Mangum, he brings a little bit of pop, but doesn't have nearly the hit tool of Jake Mangum. So they're basically just sort of changing the flavor of the month when it comes to which type of 4th outfielder they want. The Rays are in this trade. And then they're getting Anderson Brito, who arm late in our ranking of the top prospects in the Astro system. He said Anderson Brito is the highest upside arm in the Astro system at the time. A guy that still has a lot of development that needs to be done, but a really nice prospect for the Rays to pick up. The Rays are again trading Lowe, they're trading Mangum, they're trading Montgomery, and they got the 2 Astros prospects in return. So they're flipping prospects with the Astros, and the Pirates, because they traded the starting pitcher, are getting the best player in the deal in Mike Burrows, and a couple of other, not in Mike Burrows, and Brandon Lowe for Mike Burrows, and a couple of nice pieces. So again, that's just showing you the value that's being put on a starting pitcher. And to illustrate that further, Shane Baz got traded, another Rays trade. The Rays trade Baz for an absolute haul. They get 4 prospects and a draft pick in return for a pitcher that had a 4.87 ERA last year. Now, granted, Shane Baz has really good stuff. Other teams probably view him as a potential frontline starter if everything breaks right, and there's 3 years of control. But you can't just discard the fact that he has had a 4.87 ERA last year and has been hurt throughout his career. But the Orioles are willing to part with Caden Bonine, who was their 30th overall pick in this past draft. So the 30th overall pick in the draft, not their 30th pick. The 30th overall pick, a late first-round pick, high probability big league catcher, Slater DeBrune, who was an overslot pick just outside the first round in that comp round. So still, I guess, technically a first-round pick, 37th overall. He got $4 million to sign. I mean, that is real first-round money for an 18-year-old outfielder that's not going to turn 19 until the middle of the upcoming season. So a ton of development runway for the Rays on Slater DeBrune. They also get Austin Overn, an outfielder who stole 64 bases in only 112 games between high A and double A this past year. Probably a 4th outfielder, but not bad. I mean, it's, almost, I don't know if he's quite the prospect of Nick Morabito, but, you're talking about a speedy outfielder. It's not nothing. And he was a former 3rd-round pick in 2024. And they're also getting Michael Ferret, a pitcher had a 1.58 ERA last year between high A and double A. I mean, that is a ton, and they get a comp pick on top of it. At Just Baseball, this is 3 of the top 10 prospects in the Orioles system, plus a 4th piece, plus a draft pick for a guy in Shane Baz that's coming off a bad season. I say all of this because right now the Mets are in the market to add a starting pitcher. But if you're going to the trade market and that's the cost for Shane Baz, that's the return for Mike Burrows, what are the Brewers going to want for Freddy Peralta? That's what we're going to talk about next. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. The World Cup is coming back to North America for the first time since 1994. And for the first time ever, 48 teams are going to compete, which will be massive. But let's be honest, getting tickets, that's usually the hard part. That's why the Game Time map is so clutch, because it finally gives fans a real advantage when it comes to snagging seats. With Game Time, you can track price drops in real time, get alerts when great seats open up, and you can buy tickets the moment they hit the app. It puts the power back in your hands and makes going to the World Cup realistic instead of impossible. Pick a game, tap a section, and have your tickets locked in within minutes. No confusion, no hunting through the fine print. Prices include fees up front, which I love. So you're not going to get that last second surprise at checkout. And you'll get alerts for teams and matches, which will make it easy to grab tickets the moment they drop instead of missing out. Take the guesswork out of buying World Cup tickets with every match, every concert, every event, anywhere you're trying to go where you need a ticket. Use Game Time. Download the Game Time app. Create an account. Use the code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, download the app. Make an account. Use the code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Swipe, tap, ticket, go. Game Time. If you're watching on YouTube, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Help us get closer to our next goal of 16,000 subscribers. So as we look at the trade market, if Mike Burrows is worth Brandon Lowe, a fourth outfielder in Mangum, and a left-handed reliever who throws 98 miles per hour, what is Brandon Sproat worth? Brandon Sproat's still a top 100 prospect with 6 years of team control. Now, the Mets don't need Brandon Lowe, a fourth outfielder, and if they get a left-handed reliever that throws 98, they would much prefer someone like Adrian Morejon that did so with a low ERA because it doesn't walk the world like Mason Montgomery did for the Rays last year. But it goes back to, what is Brandon Sproat worth to the Mets? I think Brandon Sproat certainly should not be on the table for Nick Pivetta. If Mike Burrows can get you all of this, I'd like to see Brandon Sproat pitch for a year, prove he's a big league starter, and then if you need to do more with him, flip him next year, and you can get 3 big league pieces for Brandon Sproat. And if he's even better than that and showcases some of the upside of Shane Baz, you might be able to trade him after having him pitch for 3 years. And when he still has 3 years left to control, you might be able to trade Brandon Sproat for 4 prospects in a draft pick like Shane Baz just got. If the industry is valuing young starting pitching this much, then you should be very careful about trading yours. You should be very careful about putting Brandon Sproat or Jonah Tong on the table. And the only way you do is if you're getting a star back in return, and honestly, a star with control. Are you putting Brandon Sproat on the table for Freddy Peralta? Probably, if you want Freddy Peralta, and he's only making $8 million. So yes, it's going to cost a lot to get him. And if Shane Baz got that level of a package, you can say, well, does it take 6 prospects to get Freddy Peralta? I think the difference is, if you're looking at all the pieces that went out to get Shane Baz, you didn't have any consensus top 100 prospects. And so I will say the difference as far as why those 2 specific trades don't necessarily preclude the Mets from going on the trade market is because the Mets have better pieces they can put on the table, where putting Brandon Sproat in a trade could account for multiple pieces, in the Baz deal, right? Because that's how, much more valuable a piece like Sproat or Tong is than anything that, was put on the table for the Orioles to get Baz from the Rays. But still, it just shows you that price, right? That for the Rays to part with Baz, they were able to extract multiple guys that were just drafted who they believe that, I'm sure, they can turn into even better prospects. They can turn the recent first-round picks into top 100 prospects at some point in the upcoming season or in the upcoming few seasons. Because they also, for a franchise that's perpetually in a 40-man roster crunch, the Rays got guys that they're not going to have to worry about putting on their 40-man roster anytime soon. It was a specific trade that made sense for those 2 sides. But as we then try to look at, okay, well, where the Mets trade for a starter, it's tough to pry Mackenzie Gore. It's tough to pry Sandy Alcantara when they're now going to look at what the return was for Baz and say, okay, we need to get at least that, if not better, because they might think that their pitchers are better, even if they come with a year less of control. And so it might be even harder to pull off a trade for one of those arms. Ultimately, yes, the Mets have the prospects to get a trade done. They have the depth in their farm system even to put together a bunch of prospects that are outside of their top, 6. If you were to center a package around Jacob Reimer, or if you're going further down, Nick Morabito, Jack Weninger, Jonathan Santucci, Will Watson. You want to go further down into the system, Zach Thornton and RJ Gordon. I mean, they have a lot of arms that they can put out there in trades, but to meet the price to get a Freddy Peralta, I think it's getting to the point where you're going to have to part with Brandon Sproat. You might have to part with Brandon Sproat and Jett Williams in the same trade. And yes, if you get Freddy Peralta back and you get Trevor McGill back and you extend Freddy Peralta, I'd be okay giving up 2 top 100 prospects to get Peralta and McGill, but you're giving up a lot to do so. Then you get to, I think, the few starting pitchers that you can trade for where you don't have to trade a Brandon Sproat, but they come with massive caveats. For Nick Pivetta, we've talked about that as a potential trade, $19 million for this upcoming season. If that's all he had on his contract, if it was just 1 year, $19 million, well, now you're talking about trading a lot more to get him, but he's got 2 poison pill options for the team that trades for him. Because if Nick Pivetta is terrible next season or he gets hurt, he's opting into $14 million for 2027. And then if he's not good again, he's opting into even more money for 2028. So if you're the Mets and you have a payroll right now, we're going to talk about that more in the next segment, where Juan Soto is $51 million a year, Francisco Lindor is 34. Sean Manaea, you have no idea what he's going to look like for this upcoming season, but he's on your books for $25 million. You have Jorge Polanco. I just saw his contract is backloaded. He's getting paid $23 million next year. 17 for this upcoming season, but $23 million. And it doesn't stop there. Kodai Senga has money on the books. Luke Weaver, Devin Williams. There's so much money on the books. If you want to make a run at Skubal next year, where you're going to have to pay him maybe $40-45 million a season, do you want to get saddled with Nick Pivetta? Do you want to get to a point where this season Nick Pivetta gets hurt, Kodai Senga's unpitchable, Sean Manaea isn't helping you much in the rotation, and next year you have $28 million tied up in Pivetta and Senga, and then 25 more in Sean Manaea? Factor in deferrals all you want. That's $50 million and 3 guys you might not even want in your rotation. Makes Pivetta look a lot less attractive. The other guy that you can trade for where you don't have to give up the prospect capital is Luis Severino. Now, I have talked about him on the show. At one point, I mentioned the idea of Jeff McNeil and Kodai Senga going for Luis Severino, and the purpose in that would be getting off of money. It's a salary dump for a salary dump. And Luis Severino last year on the road pitched to an ERA of close to 3. At home in a minor league ballpark where the mound's terrible in Sacramento, he had an ERA of 6. I actually don't think Severino is the worst guy to trade for. Fans, when I tweeted this out, reacted because it's, Kodai Senga is better than Luis Severino. Not if you're trying to move off of Kodai Senga and you don't want him on your books because you don't think he's going to be healthy. And if you can get off the entirety of the Jeff McNeil contract, well, now you're clearing $39 million, close to $40 million on those 2 guys, and you're picking up $20 million for the upcoming season for Sevy. That would make some sense for a Mets team that has other moves they want to make. If they felt like Severino was a guy that they can trust to give them 180 innings, and maybe that's what they need right now when the market is thinning for options. If you're not going to, if it comes down to the Pivetta trade or the Severino trade, I think I'd prefer Severino only because it's one less year you might be stuck with them. And both of these guys, if they pitch well, Severino or Pivetta, both of them are going to be free agents because for Severino, you got a player option too. Now, if you could find a different trade for Kodai Senga where you get something back, that would be preferred, certainly. But if you're just in the business of trying to dump Kodai Senga's salary, you could find worse ways of doing it. So everything's tied together. We're going to talk about the payroll in the next segment. But if you still need to add a starting pitcher, add a big bat, add to your bullpen. To fill all of these different things, it's going to take a lot of money to do it, and you're going to have to move off of some money to be able to address everything. Now, if you're going to trade for Freddy Peralta, I hope you extend them, but maybe for the Mets, the value is more that he's only making $8 million. And it allows you to do other things. The bottom line, though, as far as the trades are concerned, is it is going to cost a lot to get a starting pitcher. And teams now are only going to be more emboldened to ask for more. And I think we could see guys staying put. I think you could see Pivetta staying put because ultimately no team is willing to meet the price that A.J. Preller is going to ask for. Same thing with the two Marlins arms and same thing with Mackenzie Gore. You would think that with Mackenzie Gore only having 2 years of control, he's definitely going to get moved. But if they set that price at a point where no team wants to meet that prospect return, you really could see a lot of these guys staying put because the ask is just that crazy. But we have been sort of broaching this idea of payroll, and that was one of the big stories of the day. Mike Puma of the Post put something out there about what the Mets payroll is estimated to be. Fans reacted, and then Steve Cohen reacted to the fan reaction. So we're going to close the show there in just a minute. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. NFL Sundays move fast. One big play and suddenly everything feels different. That's what makes live betting with FanDuel so exciting. You're not just watching the game, you're reacting to it in real time. With FanDuel, you can place live bets as the action unfolds, every drive, every momentum swing, every highlight moment. Live betting is best when the game starts to shift, a receiver gets hot, a defense tightens up, or the momentum flips after a turnover. FanDuel lets you jump into that moment with live spreads and the money lines that adjust instantly. You have player props that update as guys get hot, and you can bet the next touchdown scorers, drive results, totals, and more. It keeps you locked into every snap, every drive, every possibility. So if you want to be right in the middle of the action this season, visit FanDuel.com and place your NFL live bets all season long. That's FanDuel. The game moves fast, and so can you. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day, and thank you for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network. You already live your team every day. Now take it up a level and go ad-free. Join the Everydayer Club today and get Locked On Mets with no interruptions, members-only Discord access, and more, all for just $5 a month or $50 a year. Go to lockedonmets.supercast.com or check the link in the show notes to learn more. All right, so let's talk about the story of the day on social media. And that is stemming from some tweets by Steve Cohen. It all started with an article in the New York Post about Pete Alonso and how his free agency played out, where essentially the Mets had no expectation that a team was going to pony up and pay for him the way the Orioles did. And by the time they found out what that price tag was, they didn't even submit an offer because it got to a point that they were not willing to go to re-sign Pete. That was the Cliff Notes version of the story. But within that article, there was a section where he talks about the Mets payroll, and the Post reports the Mets estimate their payroll for next season to fall somewhere in the $310 to $320 million range, with multiple holes remaining. This much seems clear. The team isn't in a hurry to challenge the Dodgers payroll mark from last season of $400 million. Fans react because the current payroll projections are $295 million. So if you think that the Mets are only going to spend $15 million more, you get a reaction. And here comes Steve Cohen. As typical, the usual idiots misinterpreting a Post article on Mets payroll for 2026. I can't imagine our payroll to be lower than last year. It's always hard to predict, but that would be my best guess. And then he continues on with another tweet saying payroll watchers always forget to budget for waiver claims, player movement from minors to the majors, and trade deadline moves. That's how it typically works. I will hold my hand up here and admit I have talked about the Mets payroll all offseason, and I've said that ultimately I think they will end up where they've been the last 3 years, and that's $340 million. What I haven't done is described exactly what he's talking about. That's the Mets' end of the season payroll. And so going into the season, you have to leave room because at the trade deadline, you might decide that you are going to pick up a player who's got a $30 million salary and is prorated. Well, all of a sudden, now you're adding on more than $10 million to your payroll and things shoot up. What I will say about the Mets payroll, everything is subject to change. Everything is case by case basis. If things have dragged on in the offseason and the Mets are able to swoop in and sign Alex Bregman on a 1-year deal, and they decide that they want to do that, they might just go ahead and do that and blow past where their payroll is supposed to be. I think it's always up to change based on the market and what they think is the right move. They will stretch things a little bit. But going into opening day last year, Cots, this I found from a Metsmerized article, they cited Cots baseball contracts. The opening day payroll began just over $320 million last year. It's around $322 million. End of the season payroll got to that $340 million range I've been talking about, $338 million. So that would suggest that the Mets probably need to move off of Senga and Jeff McNeil to open up the spending that will be required to fully address this roster. But a lot can still happen. There's a world where the Mets go throughout their offseason plan and maybe they decide that the cost of acquisition for Cody Bellinger and Kyle Tucker, a little too steep. Maybe they decide that trading for Jarren Duran or Luis Robert isn't the wisest thing. And so they might get to the point where Jeff McNeil is their starting left fielder, and they're going to leave room for Jett Williams and Carson Bench to hopefully fill out that outfield by the middle of the season. Or Ryan Clifford could always play a corner too. Not well if you're talking about run prevention, but that could happen. There's a world where it might make more sense to keep these guys with the investments that they have in Senga and McNeil rather than trying to move off of that money for one that's going to cost something to eat down those contracts. That might be unattractive if you're not getting anything back in return and you have to eat something down. I think that shows why it's going to be still tough to move these guys because you either want to just, for Jeff McNeil, I think if you could move the entire contract, it's a big enough number that you would do that. It's an interesting one when you're looking at the Mets payroll now because most projections have them at $295 million. So if, let's just call it 320, and let's say Cody Bellinger is getting $25 million, well, if you make that signing, that's it. You'd be done on spending unless you move some money. Now, what else would you need? You need a starting pitcher. So then, okay, even more of a reason to trade for Freddy Peralta because he only cost you $8 million. And in that trade, maybe you're able to entice the Brewers to take David Peterson back. And it's the money is a direct swap. You throw in the prospect capital to get the pitcher, and then, okay, now the Peralta thing fits into where your payroll's at. I will say this. Just because Steve Cohen can doesn't mean that he should, and doesn't mean that we as fans should expect it. This guy has run payrolls that we never would have dreamed of for 5 years now. And we as fans have gotten a little bit spoiled by that, right? We're no longer grading Steve Cohen based on what it used to be like. We're grading Steve Cohen on what it's been like. Now, what he's saying is, I'm going to keep the payroll consistent, which is what I've been saying all offseason the Mets would do. But when you're not factoring in the in-season additions to the payroll, there's a chunk that I've been overlooking, and I'll own it. I've overlooked that $15 million. And so when I've been campaigning for the Mets to just keep Jeff McNeil, because who cares about the money? Jeff McNeil off your bench makes you a better team. Well, maybe you need to trade Jeff McNeil to split that $15 million up on 2 relievers. I think the most likely outcome, we see Jeff McNeil and Cody Bellinger getting traded for other pieces that have money attached to them that are different additions that'll help this roster. So, for example, you trade Jeff McNeil and Nick Morabito, and you get Luis Robert, where you up your payroll by $4.25 million for Robert, which isn't that much of an addition, and he's your starting center fielder, and you're betting on the upside. And you've exchanged Jeff McNeil for a higher upside player. Where you trade Cody Bellinger, and it's in a deal where you're getting Nick Pivetta back, or Cody Bellinger is, some of the money is getting eaten down, but maybe not as much as I've been projecting. Maybe it's just to make his salary consistent with Freddy Peralta if you make the Brewers trade. Or you find a team that is willing to take on either of those players, and you're not getting much back in return. But it does make the puzzle that the Mets are trying to put together a little bit more complicated when you think about their spending and think, okay, what do they do with $25 million? And that's where you would like to maybe move off of an additional 20 between Senga, McNeil, or Senga and Peterson, or McNeil and Peterson, so that you can reinvest it and land a Cody Bellinger and address your rotation with your prospects and sign some relievers. We'll see. I am not going to react to this story and use it as an opportunity to rip ownership, because, again, we have to remember what it used to be like. And Juan Soto's on the New York Mets right now because of Steve Cohen. And I promise it is not as bad as it's being. Like, don't listen to John Heyman talk about the Mets roster, or people that want to say the Mets have a 75-win roster right now. That's ridiculous. They underperformed last year. I think they could roll it out right now with what they have, and honestly be in the wild card race pretty comfortably, because I don't think the rotation is nearly as bad as people think it is. I don't think this lineup is as bad as people think it is. And I think the farm system is that good that they're going to be able to help this team in a meaningful way this upcoming season. But obviously, you still want to see this team go into the season with less doubts and to not look worse on paper because you have failed to replace Pete Alonso and Edwin Diaz. I know with Jorge Polanco, they feel like they've replaced him in some way, but it's not the same thing. And one last thing that I want to talk about the payroll, and the one place that I will criticize a little bit. If the Mets go into this season and Jeff McNeil is starting in left field, or they made a trade where they gave up a really good prospect because they wanted Nick Pivetta and Ramon Laureano at his cheap salary and left. If you look at this offense, and it looks a lot worse because there's no Alonso and there's no Nimmo, and Marcus Semien was a defensive addition. I think it's fair to note that the Mets ate $5 million in Nimmo's contract for this year. They took on $26 million in Marcus Semien. 6 plus 5 is 11, plus $20 million per on Polanco. That's $31 million for Pete Alonso. So if the offseason comes to an end and the Mets roster looks incomplete, where you have not found a way to get an outfielder that's going to complete your run prevention out there, and it's Jeff McNeil in left, or it's Ramon Laureano left, who honestly doesn't really help your run prevention anyway. He's not meaningfully better than Brandon Nimmo defensively. He has a better arm, but that's about it. If your roster and your lineup does not look better, and you sacrificed a fan favorite in Pete Alonso because you didn't want to meet a price, but you're paying that same price for the Semien Nimmo swap and Polanco, it's not the best look. It isn't. And I can't just completely fanboy the organization and not point things like that out. If payroll's coming into play, you got to acknowledge you ate a lot of money for this year to get off of Nimmo. And then you spent a lot of money to get Polanco. We'll see how the whole puzzle comes together. I'm still really excited to see what the Mets ultimately do, because I believe that the complete roster, when we go into spring training and we look at this team, I think Mets fans will be happy with it. But the onus is on this front office to figure it out and to work within whatever constraints they have to put together a team that looks better than the one that finished last year on paper. We'll see what happens. That's going to be all for this edition of Locked On Mets. We'll see if we get any news to react to on a Saturday. If so, definitely we'll have a show for you on Sunday. If there's no news, I might hold off until Monday, but I appreciate all of you for tuning in. Make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcast. Subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listener, your first watch every day. And thank you for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network.